The patio holds its breath at noon. Then a scream cuts the sunlight like a blade. It comes from the polished rooms of the house grande, a voice pitched to fracture the calm, and for a moment everything stops. The clink of a basin, the scrape of a broom, the far-off lowing of cattle. The sound is not merely a cry, it is a rupture in the order of the plantation, an exposed seam where all the years of small violences and careful obedience show their raw edges. That scream names a woman and a room and a certain arrangement of power. It will become in time a rumor, a whispered line in the Cenzala, a portion of a child's lesson. In the immediate, it is a hand that draws so many faces to the shutters that the air inside the house tastes of astonishment. Benedita is sweeping the yard when the sound arrives. She has the kind of stillness that comes from labor, practiced until it is bone and muscle and breath. She moves with purpose. The broom is an extension of her will, the thatch of the patio its measured territory. Her hands are not fine, but they know the ways of cotton and dish and fire. At 22, she carries her mother's rules like a garment, worn thin but fitted. "Never lower your head," her mother had said, not as a proverb but like a promise passed palm to palm. It meant keep your gaze steady in the presence of humiliation, so the shame has no place to lodge. It meant measure the spirit by the height of your eyes. The house grande faces the yard half like a theatre, half like a claim. Whitewashed walls hold the day, the wood of the shutters remembers touch. Inside, the mistress, Donna Constanza, arranges herself with the devotion of a priest. The dressing is ceremony, the mirror her altar. She keeps a collection of silver, tankards, spoons, a basin that must shine. The coronel, João Batista de Almeida, rules the land with gestures precise and public. The way he sits at table, the way he counts the ledgers, the small cruelty of a groan of displeasure when a meal is late. Tomás, the overseer, moves like a shadow's translation of the coronel's will. He knows the maps of bodies and timetables. He knows where a reprimand will thicken quickest into fear. He likes to be useful in public. Benedita's days are divided by sound. The bell at dawn, the kettle's first whimper, the clank of the chains when someone is bound for market, the soft, private sighs of the other women in the Cenzala when the moon is clean and the watchmen are careless. She knows each voice that belongs to the house, the stable boy, the cook, the child who learns to mimic the mistress in a voice too small for the manners she copies. And she knows the space where speech becomes dangerous, the drawing room where words can be used to wound, the hallway where a glance is read as permission. The Cenzala is another world. Low roofs, earth floors, the close-bodied heat of shared breath. Here the lamps are oil, and the notion of time bends to tasks that are never finished. Lucia, Maria, and Isabel are Benedita's anchors. They have hands that braid and bind and pick seeds from cotton, and also hands that practice the finger precision of closing a latch or slipping a key from a mistress's pocket. They are close in age and closer in the kind of knowledge that costs more than a bruise. The ledger of who moves where, the timing of the mistress's baths, the cadence of the coronel's rides. It is in these small collected details that discontent finds its lodgings and its plans. The women watch the house as a person watches a tide. They know which mornings Donna Constanza lingers longer in her mirror, which evenings the coronel is apt to be away at the town for accounts. They keep clocks not of metal but of habit, the way a pot begins to whistle, the pause between the mastiff's bark and the door's opening. This knowledge is gathered quietly, as if they were collecting spice and not strategy. On a morning in late summer, a minor thing occurs that will move like a stone through still water. The coronel has guests, small men whose collars are stiff with thought and whose tongues have bargain in them. There is to be a dinner set out in ceremonial plates. Donna Constanza insists the silver must appear where it always does, bright as the new moon. Her tankard, a family piece, has been stored in the pantry among the linens. It should be handed with reverence. It should be set on the table and be admired for what it signifies: lineage, order, the taste of a man who counts the value of his land by the shine in a cup. Benedita is sent for the silver. She moves through the house with a tray steady in her hands. Her palms have been tempered by heat and damp, but they carry steadiness as if it were another form of weather. The pantry is cooler. Light comes through a crack in the shutter and finds the tankard like an eye. She lifts it, and as she walks back it slips. A faint, brief thing. A grazed rim against a nail, a smudge like lightning across polished metal. It is barely there, a flaw you might miss if you were not looking for it. Donna Constanza sees it, and the breath leaves her as if she were a glass bird. Her face does that precise thing that makes men like the coronel uncomfortable, a vanity enraged. "You," she says. The single word taps the silence and sets it ringing. The room rearranges itself into positions. The guests are suddenly listeners to a private lesson in dominance. Benedita stands with the tray and does not know her own mouth. Her mother's voice threads through her thought, the old admonition as much a touchstone as a shield. Tomas steps forward, as if the situation needs architecture. He displaces a lamp and reaches for the cent measure of punishment. The slap is not severe, it is method. But in this house, method is the point. Public correction is a demonstration. The guests watch the ritual of authority unfold like a parable. Benedita is pulled to a wooden block pressed into purpose behind the dining room door, and the whip is unrolled. The air tastes of lemon from a nearby bowl and of the iron tang that lives near the master's ledger. The blows fall in order, not in fury. There is a sound they make unto dry, dull business that marks where the body has been called to account. No one in the room is surprised. That perhaps is its cruelest aspect. The act is law, law is performance. The users of violence show themselves practiced. The receivers of violence are expected to be practiced as well in receiving. In the Cenzala afterwards, Benedita is tended by Lucia and Maria, who loosen the rope and cool the heated skin with cloths wet with water and herb. They bind nothing that will scar as narrative, but they bind the immediate practical suffering with appliqué remedies. Tenderness and calculation sit side by side. They do not make of the whipping a spectacle, they make of it a ledger. It costs them labor, and they pay it in the way everyone on the plantation has learned to pay for endurance. When Benedita lies on her mat that night, the mother's phrase is a loop. Keep your chin, do not fold into shame. Hold the look steady enough to watch how the world names you. It is a complicated teaching. To never lower one's head is both armor and burden. It keeps the spirit upright before some humiliations, but it also tells the body to endure. Benedita turns the idea over. The rope had bitten her wrists. The leather had left a line across her back. But when the coronel and his guests applauded the orderliness of discipline, she knew that a scream could make other music, a definitive answer to submission that would rearrange the house's sound. The Cenzala is the place where conversations about such answers begin. The women speak in low registers, not only to avoid the eaves, but because survival practices a certain economy of words. They talk of openings, of where watchmen slacken, of where doors creak and are never mended. They measure their days against the coronel's rides. They watch the horizon for the pattern of his leaving. Benedita learns to read a clock made of chalk, the time when the mistress pulls back the curtains to the light, the hour when she draws her bath, the pause when the day seems to thin and the men's voices go to business in distant rooms. Solidarity shows itself there in small ornaments. A stitch slipped untraced, a kettle stepped closer to a flame, a misplaced spoon that will tuck itself back into a drawer with a sound like a secret. Lucia, who is practical in the broad way of women who have survived more seasons than she admits, outlines an idea like a seamstress drawing chalk. "There is a bath this week," she says. "Wednesday, noon. The water will be still and hot until the coronel returns tomorrow." She hardly locks that door. "The maid that tends the basin will be given a washcloth to change. We can time the pots." Maria adds measurement. She has an ear for choreography. When the dog barks at the eastern gate, he will be riding north. The boys take him. Tomas rides only with us, if the ledger says there is need. Isabel supplies a detail for risk. If it is noticed, we must be ready with a path. The river is the quickest. Joachim likes money and keeps his boat near where the mangroves thicken. Mano can lay a line through the reeds. It is in this meeting of small intelligences that a plan becomes possible. The women are making nothing like a guerrilla army. They are working with the materials at hand. Fire, water, timing, quiet hands. These are things they know better than any man in the house. They practice the ladling of water as if rehearsal were a prayer. They test the way a pail sounds when set on a threshold. They measure the arc of a bucket, swung by a woman who has carried grain for years and knows the way the load can be controlled by a wrist. They rehearse the routes for Benedita's withdrawal, the places she can duck to and be hidden by shadow and wood. It is not a romantic choreography. It is a ledger of escape in which the body is cast as instrument. Benedita becomes, in these evenings, both pupil and symbol. She watches Lucia shape the kettle's flame, studies Maria's eye for the mistress's rhythm, and practices her walk not as the house would prefer, but as a measure of endurance. Her own internal monologue picks at the edges of the mother's line, never lower your head, but sometimes to look someone in that face is to invite worse. There is a negotiation between the lesson and the life. Pride must not become a spectacle. Dignity must not blind to consequence. They test things small. A cloth is placed under a basin and later left at the threshold as if forgotten. A ladle is warmed and then allowed to cool by the wall where the mistress dries her hair. A boy is told to chase chickens into a certain corner at noon to make a sound that can mask a greater movement. Each test is scored for risk and reward. When a man like Tomas blusters past, they watch his hands and where his eyes fall, and how he lifts his chin in satisfaction at having exercised authority. He smiles like someone who has found his own reflection admired. There is a voice of reason in the group who insists on cost. Isabel, who has a woman's practical mind for consequence, speaks of reprisal. If you hurt the mistress, she says, they will come longer and harder. They will make examples that we will remember with our teeth on edge. They will take what they can. Her words are not a break on action, but a counting of price. She knows the arithmetic of plantation rage. Lucia nods. Maria speaks of moving the children and what will happen to any who are suspected. They accept that solidarity is a ledger. They will shelter one another, but the shelter will not make them invulnerable. In the still midnights they whisper other things, of running to a town that may or may not have a safe house, of hands on a boat that may delay because a captain decides against risk. They speak of Mano, a river guide who is more careful than most. He knows the channels, the shallow spots, the reeds where a boat can be hidden. He is a man who had once worked on a ship and remembers the sound of a distant cannon and the curve of a shoreline at dawn. He is not a myth. He is a man with reasons to trade in favors. The women understand that any escape will require payment and betrayals of habits. They will buy secrecy from someone whose interest is money, or familiarity, or quiet revenge. Mano will ask for weight in coins. He will ask for time. When the coroner announces he will ride to town for account books and debts, the house shifts its gravity a fraction. The men go about their tallied expenses. The mistress frets about silver and guests. This is the seam the women have been waiting for. Their plan requires the coronel to be away long enough for chaos to do its work. It requires Tomas to accept the illusion of control that something like a public correction provides. It requires the mistress to follow her ritual of bathing in a particular chamber that does not lock in the kind of way a prudent mistress might. All these small failures are the stuff of the plot they are building, an internal map of the house's complacencies. A week passes in tight rehearsals. Benedita's body will be the instrument of a statement, a measured one, not of melodrama, but of a deliberate reversal of the ritual of humiliation. The women agree to an action at noon, when the sun sits at the house's breast, and shadows are short and confidence is at its peak. The arc of a bucket will be their witness. Water is both weapon and symbol. It will not be thrown in rage. It will be thrown to do to the mistress what the mistress has repeatedly done to other bodies. It is a measured answer, the mirror held up to those who would polish themselves on the backs of others. They study water. The kettle's whistle is a bell. The rustle of cloth is counted. Benedita practices lifting 2 full buckets from a well, feeling, in her shoulders, the carriage of a moment. She practices the step that will let her be quick and firm. The motion is a whisper of muscle memory learned from carrying sacks of rice and the leather of children's shoes to be fixed. She practices the exact pronunciation in her throat of a sound she does not intend to make aloud. She practices looking into the mistress's face without flinching, not to gloat, but to hold accusation and to refuse to be reduced. Every rehearsal has its cost. Maria pretends to misplace a pan one afternoon and is found out by Tomas, who leans over a basin and taps her head with the flat of his palm, a warning. The women absorb the message. Advantage will not wait. Benedita receives it into her body and makes a new list of contingencies. They mobilize their sources. The boy who tends the horses will be scheduled to be kunged, a term the women use for purposely taking a job that keeps him away at a certain time. A washerwoman will be sent to fetch a forgotten cloth. They arrange small deceits as if arranging a basket for market. Each deception is the price of a larger gesture. At night, sitting around a single tallow lamp that sputters and stains the ceiling, they put names to possible outcomes. "We might be taken," Isabel says, then looks at Benedita and adds, "We might be sold to someone farther off." The words are not spoken to frighten but to prepare. The room is full of the kind of stoic arithmetic that is made necessary by those who own more than people and less than mercy. Benedita listens and thinks of her mother, a woman who had in another time once hidden a loaf of bread under straw to keep a child from going to market, and had paid for that kindness with a dozen lashes traded in a manner that would make the story the more useful for her daughters. How does one weigh an act that can free and wound both? How does one measure the value of dignity against the ledger of risk? They also converse in softer tones about the kind of myth that will come if Benedita acts. The elder women joke, because joke is a reprieve, that she will be made into a saint or a cautionary tale, depending on who tells the story. They will say she was reckless, one says. They will say she was brave, another answers. They know the tyranny of storytelling, the way the house will retell what happens to fit its own needs. Word goes round to Mano in time-honored ways. A scrap of cloth, a coin on a table, a casual instruction slipped into the ear of a travelling woman who will pass the news like a parcel. Mano is careful. He wants verification and a promise. He wants to know the day. He wants to see whether the coronel will indeed be absent long enough. Benedita and Lucia meet him at the river under a sky the colour of iron, where reeds argue with the current and the moon's ghost lingers. Mano's boat is small and low, its wake a thin thread. He lifts his hat to Benedita like someone who recognizes courage and also risk. "Do you know how it is," he says, voice a low instrument, "to move a woman at night when there are dogs and men, and a reward like a cloud hung over your head?" He does not scold, he counts. He tells them the length of time a patrol will wait before assuming a woman has gone. He tells them that bloodhounds are a force to be feared, but that sometimes a hunter does not want to track, and will instead rely on an overheard bit of gossip. His expertise is not heroic. It is prudent and mercenary. He wants coin and time, both of which the women will supply in one way or another. Mano's price is a last will. He will guide, he will ferry, he will hide, but he is not a ladder that will lift them out of consequence. He is a tool with a hand that can be bought. The day approaches. They set it at noon on a Wednesday when the coronel is due in town for the merchants. The mistress's routine will provide them the moment. The kitchen's rhythm will supply the cover. Benedita sleeps little in the days before, not with fear, but with occupation. Her muscles remember the arc of a lifted bucket, the sound of water striking a body and making a different music. She recalls the taste of the wooden block under her when she was bound. She remembers too her mother's look when she had first taught her to hold her head high, a look that was not merely pride, but a folded map, a history of bargaining with the world, gleaned from the small economies of survival. On the morning of the action, the house moves like settled weather. The coronel mounts and rides away with his ledger, his horse's hooves a drumbeat that is at once ordinary and liberating. The mistress nods with the air of someone who has arranged the shape of the day and believes in its small certainties. The bath will be uninterrupted, the silver admired, the guests impressed. Tomas is at his usual post, because the habit of authority is to place itself where everyone might see it. The men in the stables are told to oil a cart, the boys to sweep a lane. Each commanded motion is a cover for a greater stillness waiting to break. Benedita moves through the kitchen where the heat is a slow, climbing animal. The kettles are wound on the flame, and the water boils in a cadence she knows like a prayer's meter. The pails are filled at the well and carried to the hearth, their rims wet and thrumming. Lucia slides a second pail toward her without a look, an offering passed over like a coin, and Maria positions herself at a door to listen, not to spy, but to make certain that any noise is interpreted as kitchen sound. Isabel waits near the back way with a shawl and a route mapped in her mind. They have rehearsed how to move. They have practiced the arc of a thrown pail until Benedita's shoulders have built the memory. There is a particular steadiness to her hand as she lifts the buckets, as if she is holding the weight of all the small insults the house has been. Her mouth holds the shape of the mother's phrase, the commandment and the prayer, "Never lower your head." She repeats it under her breath until the syllables are a talisman. It is not bravado. It is the way she steadies her pulse. No one in the yard notices the pressure in the light. The men move in their habitual certainties. The children scuffle with a kind of inert innocence. The kettle's whistle is a small signal. The dog barks in a place that makes Thomas look up and then relax. Lucia pinches a cloth to stop a squeak on a hinge. These are the minor manipulations that make the plan possible. When Benedita approaches the door that leads to Donna Constanza's bathing chamber, she is not a frenzy of fury, but a woman carrying a library of wrongs in 2 pails. The wood of the threshold is warm. Through the crack in the shutters, she sees for the first time in the morning the mistress's reflection in a small hand mirror, the face pulled to a kind of soft wrath at a spot invisible to others. Benedita's hand does not shake. Her muscles are work-hardened. Her decision is steady. She kneels a fraction to position herself, and then rises, bucket-balanced. The arc is practiced. It is the most dangerous moment. The throw will make a sound like a slap, and sound will call attention faster than any shadow. Benedita thinks, in the motion, of the whipping that had been practiced for authority. The rope, the wooden block, the dry sound against skin. She thinks of Lucia's hands cooling her, of Maria's whispers about boats and reeds. She thinks of Mano's low-eyed bargain at the river. She thinks always of her mother saying, "Never lower your head." The water leaves the pail and flies in an arc through the noon air. It catches light like a brief broken mirror and strikes a body in a way that demands a voice. The sound ruptures the day, a breathless call, not only a woman's voice, but a small hurricane that rearranges where people stand. The mistress screams. The sound is public, explosive, and it lands like an accusation. It is heard beyond the thresholds, beyond the servants' rooms, rising to the shutters where the guests lean and to the stables where the men freeze and look. The house for an instant forgets its choreography. At that instant, Benedita has done what she meant to do. She has made the lady scream in front of everyone. The patio becomes a scene where order and disorder clash like 2 instruments struck at once. Tomas tries to command with a voice shuttered by surprise. The guests gape. Some men step forward, others are rooted by the audacity that has uncoiled in full sun. The mistress, wet and furious, presses her hand to her face as if to gather herself into dignity that a single splash has undone. It is a sound that will, from this day forward, be a landmark in the house's memory. It is also, in the immediate, a live danger. The water is a symbol that has become an act. Now the plantation's machinery will respond. Someone will shout, someone will run, men will move like cogs re-engaged. Benedita's plan includes what will come next. The extraction, the hidden path, Mano's boat waiting under the river's reeds. But plans are thin sheets. They bend and tear when men add confusion to the wind. In the kitchen, Maria makes a sound like an oven falling open, and the children are made to scream as if there were a greater, unexpected cause. Lucia and Isabel create a hubbub that is domestic in outward shape, but tactical in essence. They move as if to render aid, to gather damp towels, to pretend that this is only an accidental spill of soap. But every motion is an improvised sentence in a longer story. To buy time, to cover the shape of Benedita's retreat, to trick the watchers with the apparel of normality. Benedita steps back through the door, not running but walking with the economy of someone who must not be perfumed by panic. She ducks low, and in the same instant, a boy from the stables stumbles toward the porch with a message, a false message, perhaps prearranged, perhaps improvised. Tomas folds in on himself like a net thrown to catch what is flying. He does not at first order a chase. He calls instead for sense, for the return of the kind of authority that is enacted by commands. It is a hesitation that will cost them advantage, and no hesitation comes without reason in the ledger of revolt. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, the coronel's horse lets out a startled sound, as a man on horseback looks back and reconsiders his pace. A guest places a hand to a side, not from urgent aid, but from an offended sense of propriety. The house has become a loud room of private violations transposed to public view. And then, as the water streaks the satin and the mistress shrieks, Benedita slips out of sight toward the back path, moving with the route they have rehearsed, with the steady patience of the hunted who has learned from her own making. The women at the kitchen door hold faces that could be alarmed or might be composed to fool an onlooker, and the process of movement, small, certain, begins. For a few heartbeats there is a chance that their plan will fail, and each woman is aware of the tally. There is a possibility of capture, of whiplash returned, of being cut again by a hand that believes reorder is its right. There is also the possibility that the house will be unsettled enough for Benedita to slip the net of its laws and find Mano's small obedient boat on the black skin of the river. In the pause between the scream and the movement, the whole household recalibrates. It is in this narrow hinge that a life is wagered, where a single refusal of humiliation becomes the fulcrum of uncertain futures. The patio still smells of lemon and smoke. The sun has swallowed a little more of the world into glare. The phrase is a chorus on Benedita's lips, nearly a prayer now, nearly a command, never lower your head. Outside, the path is waiting like a line of shadow. The reeds at the river's edge will offer concealment. Mano's boat will answer the sound of oars like a reply. Behind her, the house will scream itself into action, as great machines always do when small parts fail. The mistress will not be reduced to a single act of wetness. She will marshal dignity, weaponize insult, gather the make of men. Tomas will shout names. The coronel miles away will be told and will count and will act, because to have a mistress humiliated in front of guests is to have an account unsettled. But in the small full minute before all that movement, before searches, before the raising of rewards, before the after-stories to be told in whispers for years, the world narrows to the pressure in Benedita's shoulders and the arc of water that already hangs in memory. She slips between the fence and the ruined hedge toward the grasses that hide the back road, and the women in the kitchen resume their work with hands that have been taught to make the ordinary out of chaos. If you find this story gripping, subscribe for more historical episodes. They do not yet know what the day will cost. The immediate is a rush of small necessities, a horse that might be let loose to smell the wrong thing, a child who might cry and make everything worse, the dog that might bark and find a scent. Benedita moves like a thought that has been practiced until it almost feels like a memory, and Mano waits with the dark water that knows how to hold people and secrets. At the river, the reeds crackle underfoot. Mano's craft is low and smells of tar and old rope. He holds the gunwale steady and looks at Benedita with an expression that wants no mistakes. He is an old man of the water who listens for the sound of hounds before he hears the lightest whisper. Benedita climbs with an economy that keeps sound to the surface and the breath of the boat shallow. The oars take hold of water and make a hush across the skin of the river. All the while the house behind them convulses with alarm, the sound of a master's household rearranging itself like quick furniture in a storm. As they push into the river, where the current is a slow hand, possibilities spread like a fan. There will be those who say later that Benedita's face was pale and set like the will of a woman who had read too many epilogues. Others will say she laughed in the dark, or that she sang a song as they slipped under a hanging branch. The truth in such moments is a weary mixture, fear and relief braided. Mano rows with measured strokes, and the water eats the sound of their passage. Night and reeds swallow the shape of escape, but they do not swallow the consequences. Word reaches the plantation like a contagion. Tomas is a fast man when the notion of preserving his standing is in his hands. He organizes men and dogs, he posts rewards, and he flings a net of suspicion where he cannot. The Kenzala pays its price: isolation, accusations, the tightening of rope that is used for small punishments to remind the others of a scale of control. A child is removed from one woman's arms and placed in another's care. Maria and Isabel are taken for questioning that is not rather gentle. The coronel returns with shoes that sound like verdicts. He has been told of the mistress's public shame. His countenance twists not only with the feeling that is personal, but with wounded property. His household's honor has been disturbed, and honor is the thing he trades in. Rumors multiply, and the story of what happened begins its motion as both fact and legend. Some say that Benedita was taken the next morning by the river's men, sold beyond the deepenings of the map. Others swear that she made a life under an assumed name, and that she married a man who did not ask her history. In the Cenzala, the words of the days become simplified into lessons. Children will be told the story with a tilt toward caution. Do not be foolish. The older women will tell it with the tilt toward courage. The library of its telling will vary with the teller. Donna Constanza retreats from the sunlight of the veranda for a time. She stops attending the small dinners and whispers of illness that are less about fever than about dignity marred. The coronel's pride is not easily comforted. He makes public displays of control and issues commands that are meant to settle unsettled heirs. Tomas, for his part, looks over his shoulder longer than he used to. He wonders with a new diligence whether the house can be the house it once was, unchallenged, certain, absolute. But the phrase, "never lower your head," circulates and finds homes in small mouths. It becomes a mnemonic, a test and a taunt. Parents will teach it like a geography lesson, and the Cenzala will pass it down with the kind of care that truth deserves when it must survive in the mouths of those who are treated as if they were not fully human. It will do work. It will steady a child's step. It will light up in the face of the eager to obey. It will come back sometimes with an ache, as if the phrase itself were a sharp stone placed in the pocket to remind one of cost. For Benedita, in the nights that follow, the phrase is both comfort and burden. The river has taken them for a time, and Mano has set them in a town that offers both strangers and the slight possibility of anonymity. She sleeps on a pallet in a place with rough linen and a barred window that looks out on a road rather than a field. She does not yet know whether she will be free or hunted for the rest of her days. She does not yet know how the life of those who sheltered her will go. She hears miles away the echo of the mistress's voice and the clatter of men measuring out reprisal. She remembers the wooden block and the whip and thinks of the ark of water that answered it. In houses, in Cenzalas, in the speech of the town, the story becomes a barometer. People choose versions that suit them. The coronel tells it in a way that repairs his rent honor. The mistress tells it as a personal indignity. Tomas tells it as a problem of management. The women tell it as a daring that had cost each of them some small thing. History, in the mouths of men who did not experience the risk, is tidy. For those who lived it, the story is messy, threaded with regret and small victories. The patio will remember the sound of that scream for a long time, and the house will never quite wear its whitewash the same. The matter lodges in doorways and in the way servants line up their tasks to be visible or invisible. The Cenzala changes its habits, adjusting, noting, teaching their children a line that will be part moral and part survival tactic. And Benedita, whether she becomes legend or a name erased in the records of those who write only with coin and counsel, carries the scar in the air of how a woman can, for a moment, call the household to account and make the lady scream in front of everyone. The cost will be counted 100 ways by silver and by whips and by the quiet extinguishing of lives. The seed is planted. The question is how it will grow, whether into a tree of memory or into the thin thing of rumor. Night holds its own measures. The river closes like a hand. In the dark house, the coronel burns a candle and counts his people as if they were assets. The mistress studies the reflection of her altered face and performs for herself quiet rituals to make the world believe she is whole. In the Cenzala, the women draw closer to one another, and the phrase, once a command, shifts toward a kind of hymn. Never lower your head. But even hymns have costs. The ledger of reprisal begins filling. Men ride with the air of compensation. Offers of reward are posted on poles and carried from tavern to tavern. Some of the co-conspirators will pay for what they have done with new lashes and with days given to harder work. Others will be moved to distant plantations. The plantation's social calculus will reassert itself, but inside its arithmetic, a fracture exists now, a fissure that will not close easily. In the quiet of an inn a river away, Benedita stares at the reflection in a tin cup and thinks of the patio at noon and the ark of water. The sound of a woman's scream isn't something one simply conducts and leaves behind. It echoes in the bones of people, and in the logs of a house. It changes the way people step, the way they plan, the way they reckon with dignity and cost. The story is not over. It will live differently in every mouth that finds reason to tell it. The consequences are not yet all gathered. They are like weather on the edge of a valley, promising storms that no one can fully measure. Benedita wakes with the taste of river in her mouth and the memory of paddle strokes in her limbs. The small inn where Mano has left her is a room with a shuttered window and a bed of rough straw. When wind comes, it speaks like a man with many small worries. She keeps watch on the doorway, not with the fierce vigilance of someone who expects to be captured at once, but with the slow caution of someone who knows how rumors travel like smoke. At night, she listens for dogs. In the day, she counts the steps of those who pass beneath her window. Mano has gone back upriver to settle payments and to see whether the patrols have chased dry tracks. He returns in a week with news and with a face that has been altered by the arithmetic of danger. Sometimes favorable, sometimes not, always expensive. The plantation has not been idle. Word of the mistress's public humiliation rides like a brass bell among men of order. A notice goes up in the market square, clipped and cold, reward for information leading to the apprehension of the fugitive. The coronel's signature is an adamantine thing, a public instrument. Tomas reads it aloud in the kitchen with a sound like a ledger being shut. Men in leather hats and stout boots come asking, their brows low. They smell of tobacco and of a procedural hunger that thinks a reward will fix a wound in a reputation. They question passers-by. They prod at the quilt of rumor until someone flinches. Inside the Cenzala, consequences arrive like slow storms. Tomas returns as if to finish a painting. He reinvents discipline into a canvas of exemplary punishments. He likes to demonstrate that a violated order can be remade by demonstration of force. Maria is taken for a public swearing, the kind that is meant as theatre. She stands small against the coarse light, while Tomas points and asks names. He slaps a palm in the air, and the men repeat without thinking the sanctity of ownership. They accuse, they prod. Lucia is stripped of a small privilege. Her night watch is altered, her allotment of food narrowed, and the little economies that keep a family warm go thin. Isabel is called out by name and moved to another planter's house across the river. The transfer is framed as necessity, as commerce. They are punished with labor that is sharper than it was, with eyes that count every step. The punishments are not always violent to the eye, but are violence nonetheless. A child taken from a mother to be fostered under suspicion, a woman reassigned to a perilous cotton shed, men who were friendly in their nods suddenly finding themselves with less work and fewer chances for small kindnesses. The plantation's social contract tightens like a rope. People who had been cooperative grow furtive. Those who had been complicit hesitate in ways that confuse the coronel. He answers through instruments and proclamations, measures that try to close a ruptured face with the starch of law. Donna Constanza does not remain publicly idle. She withdraws partly for the sake of wounded vanity. The mirror will not reflect what she cannot accept. And then, when the hand of argument is set, she re-enters with the armor of purpose. She visits the chapel less in contrition and more in assertion. She arranges her hair with a steadier hand, and sets the silver anew in the parlor where none but invited persons may see. The public shriek has not simply been a relaxed sound of anger. It has been an exposure, and she tends to the exposure like someone who wants to stitch skin. She makes sure the guests who remain her friends will speak of the incident as an isolated misfortune, a breach of service rather than a symptom of any structural failing. Pride requires a narrative as much as a garnish, but narratives cannot be wholly controlled. In the market, the story takes a tone of wonder. Some men whisper admiration as if courage were currency. Others call Benedita reckless and an agent of ill for men who do not like the risk of contagion. A few of the merchant class, those who have wives with fine lace and whose sensibilities are on a leash, suggest privately that the coronel might make an example that will be useful to deter others. They make cold calculations. Any woman put to shame for her boldness will make the house bigger in the places they count. Benedita learns of these things in the hush between the inn's chores. Mano brings what he can, a scrap of gossip from a tavern, a rumor of a patrol by a man he knows, a list of suitable hiding places in the shadowed quarter of a town. He speaks plainly. He has ferried men with similar needs who were taken. There are markets where they will not stop, he says, and there are men who look away. There are also men who will be paid to look. He will not promise that the road will be safe forever. He will accept coin for the present and ask for patience for the future. Benedita trades with him not only silver, but the ghosts of favors owed. A ring borrowed long ago, a seam stitched in a skirt now parted, a quiet childhood kindness. Mano counts these things the way a sailor counts knots. He weighs them in relation to mast and wind. Days become a stitched sequence of small movements. Benedita learns to alter her hair, to change the curve of her speech, to hold her hands outside the reach of watchers. In a market stall she buys a tattered shawl and folds it to hide the marks on her back. She watches her reflection in a vendor's pot and feels the way an image can both betray and protect. Friends bring food. Neighbors offer a bed for a night. People measure their risk and sometimes decide their choices by what their lives allow. A widow with few ties might give Benedita a mattress. A baker's apprentice might turn his head the other way when a man asks questions. Back on the plantation, Tomas tightens. He posts men at crossroads, sends out riders with lists of features to spot. The shape of a hand, a certain gait, the way a woman carries buckets. They stop a traveler who looks like Benedita and ask a dozen questions. They are disappointed by a young woman who has had nothing to do with the affair. Suspicion, in such places, turns neighbors against neighbors. A woman in the Cenzala trades a spilled cup for a rumor, and then tells Tomas of an untrustworthy face she has seen toward the river. It is often the small practical bargains of fear that move the machinery of repression forward. Some punishments are direct. Maria is flogged for refusing to speak, or for speaking in a way that Tomas decides is unbecoming. The lash does not tear, but leaves a band of memory across her spine that will ache for months. Isabel's transit to another house is the thing everyone understands as a form of exile. Moving is a kind of erasure. Lucia stands then in the Cenzala, with her hands smoothed by work and the new weight of responsibility. She has sheltered Benedita with the pragmatic competence of someone who knows the price of shelter. She has now to bear the accounting for losses, the absent beds, the reassignments, the children moved. The solidarity that formed the plan is not undone, but is rent. It adapts and is rendered more discreet. The coronel, for his part, does not let the matter fall into private ire alone. He hosts a gathering, a breakfast where cattle accounts and law are discussed in words that sound ordinary, and the undercurrent is authority. He trades in admonitions and in the choreographed acts of public correction. He commands that the men tighten lines, that the plantation's boundaries be watched, that the men who own hunting dogs be invited to bring them near the river. He uses ritual to restore ritual, and with each decree the house bends back toward itself. Yet in the public eye the house is no longer the same image. Something small within its whitewash has become a shade that will not be painted out. Rumors of Benedita's sightings begin to spread as reliably as the wind along the river. A washerwoman in a coastal town swears she saw a woman with a shawl like Benedita's at a quay. A tavern owner insists a woman fit the description and sang a tune about a river at dusk. Some people speak as eyewitnesses, others as hearsay travelers. In all cases, the stories bear the tendency of history. Each teller modifies, each listener carries a variant. In the Cenzala, children learn to recite the episode in rhyme. In the market, the story becomes a seasoning to an evening drink. It stretches, shortens, acquires moral for the teller. For those who suffered the punitive acts, the story is a sharp instrument to gauge justice. For others it is a curiosity. Benedita in her moving is careful. She does not become a phantom wholly. She leaves traces that are not easily explained. A seamstress in a town north of the plantation recalls a woman buying thread with an odd parsimony, or perhaps a woman who asked twice for a measure of cloth for a new pair of sleeves in a different style. A boatman in another town tells of a pale woman who asked for a bed not for the night but for a week, paying extra, as if to ensure no one would risk their reputation to inform against them. Sometimes she writes with her fingers into the dirt, tracing a child's face the way one might test a world. Mano is not immune to the pressure. A man who knows channels knows when routes are watched and when they are not. He keeps his boat near mud banks and moves people in small, deliberate trades, sometimes ferrying a merchant's contraband and sometimes a mother and child. He watches faces the way a mariner watches clouds. He becomes cautious with the payments he accepts. He demands more for further travel. He refuses once to take Benedita further on the coast, because the price is too high and the risk undue. Benedita listens. She folds the refusal into her ledger. She will find other means. Living as an outlaw, or as a woman without the predictable shelter of a household, produces its own grammar of choices. Benedita learns to keep a low profile and also to read the public mood where she rests. She meets other women who have escaped for a spell and then been recaptured. She hears their languages, the ways they judged their own courage and their own errors. She hears stories of women who crossed the sea and who did not return to the places they had known, who found towns where white men were fewer and the lines of ownership blurred for a time. She hears, too, of captives who were sold in a market and never seen again. Each story is a lesson and a caution. Months pass. The house is a place of quiet attention and louder pretense. Donna Constanza begins to sequester herself in private rooms more often. She employs a new maid who is distant and carefully chosen. She plants a border of roses behind the veranda, as if to control what may touch the house's skin. The coronel expands the remit of security. He places more men near the river and gives the hunters pay. Tomas is promoted, in his own eyes. He walks with a smaller smile and a bigger stick. He chooses punishments designed both to shame and to instruct. He makes public the names of those suspected. He holds hearings where the guilty are mandated to repair, and where, for some, the repairs consist of labor redoubled until the body's use is exhausted. Not all the conspirators are found. Some slip away to places where the map is a matter of rumor, where quilombos and hidden settlements make a different kind of law. Others find work in towns where their names are not known. It is possible that Benedita is among those who find a new life in fragments and in the work of survival. It is also possible that she moves from one market to another until the map becomes a noise. The truth is not a simple ledger that any hand can read. It is rather a braided series of possibilities that requires patience to hold. Within the Kenzala, there is a slow process of memorializing, of turning an event into a story that can travel. The women speak in codes and in lullabies. They teach children to hold their chins high in a quick, practical lesson. If you are asked who you are, keep your eyes on the adult and name yourself as you must. The elders sketch the outline of a moral vocabulary. Courage is not only the throwing of a bucket, it is also the acceptance of what follows. They name the price of audacity, and they name the benefit. A new dignity stands in a place the house cannot quite reach. It is not a neat victory. It is something more like a mark on the land, subtle, permanent, hard to erase completely. News reaches a distant town that a woman matching Benedita's description boarded a coastal schooner, bound for a port several leagues away. It is the kind of rumor that flutters with possibility. A neighbor of the coronel's, a trader who likes to know things, claims to have seen a ship taking on a woman at night who fit the description. Others say the ship was full of merchandising, and that no woman could have boarded at that hour. The contradictory reports become their own kind of history. Some would like a tidy end. Others prefer a myth. Time softens some edges and hardens others. The coronel grows older and less inclined to take risks with his own prestige, but his house never fully recovers its unruffled surface. People who remember the day of the scream speak with a changed rhythm. Servants align their tasks with a new circumspection. The house's history becomes a ledger in which some entries are smudged, some underlined with dramatic ink. The phrase "never lower your head" migrates from advice to cultural artifact. Parents in the Kenzala sometimes use it as a bedtime counsel, sometimes as a warning. It is said to children as advice not to bow before humiliation's first bite, but also to elders as a way to explain why someone might take a risk. The phrase becomes a refraction. To some it is foolish pride, to others an incitement to dignity. Years later the story accrues the softening of time. In the market someone will retell the incident with a comedic note, another will speak of it with reverence. The mistress's decline in public society becomes a slow unthreading. She no longer hosts the same suppers. Her circle shrinks. The coronel, too, becomes more cautious. He does not stop counting, but he counts in ways the house can no longer ignore, like a man who has been surprised and now keeps closer watch on his keeping. Among the people who survived those weeks, memory becomes a patchwork. Lucia keeps an embroidered cloth that she will not wear in public. It is the story of a hand that steadied another in flight. Maria keeps a scar she will not discuss, except sometimes in small confidences. Isabel, who left the house for a distant plantation, hears the rumor mill differently and finds that distance changes the tone of blame and pity. Each of them interprets their part of the ledger in personal ways, as a price paid, as a debt owed, as a misstep that taught them about the cost of action. In the villages and in the little churches, the tale changes tone again. A mother will tell her son that dignity must not lead to recklessness. A grandmother will glare and say it is better to hold to courage and risk for the future than to bend to every indignity. The story becomes a lesson and a riddle. What is the right thing to do when the law is not justice? Sometimes the story gains a miraculous cast. Old women with small watchful faces might whisper that Benedita was saved by the river's patron saints, that her name became a song on the lips of fishermen who believe in the kindness of strangers. A child might be told she became a seamstress in a port city and taught free girls to stitch their own freedom with needles and with hush. In other tellings, people speak of her capture and sale far to the south, of a woman who was taken and never seen again. Both tales live because people need endings, but the only certain thing is the scream, the moment of public reversal, the noon when water answered a whip. Sometimes on a certain wind, a market vendor will pretend to reenact the act as a jest, throwing a pail of water in mockery, and someone will hiss at the blasphemy. The memory is still tender in small ways. The house's whitewash continues to be repainted, but never quite the same. Small fissures gather in the wood. The patio continues to collect the light at noon and to keep the dent where a bucket might once have struck, whether the dent is real or imagined. Decades fold and then fold again. Children of the Cenzala who heard the story retell it in new forms. In one version, Benedita becomes the star of a sermon about pride. In another, she is the protagonist of a song about river knights. A schoolboy who grew up near the river claims to have seen a woman with a particular manner of walking in a port, and swears his grandfather told him the story directly. An old woman in a neighboring district keeps a bowl made of a certain silver that when she tells the tale she insists was polished that very day in honor of a prayer. Memory tends to accumulate such tokens. The moral of the episode remains complex. For some it is a cautionary tale about the cost of daring. For others it is a moment of inspiration. A woman chose to turn a ritual of humiliation back toward its source, and for an instant the house's net was shown to be fabric rather than a wall. Neither reading is wholly false, neither erases the other. The ledger remains. There was a scream at noon, it echoed through the shutters, and then lives were altered, some permanently, some less so. Benedita's fate, whatever way it bends, occupies more than mere curiosity. She becomes, to those who knew her, a living lesson, and for those who never saw her, a shape in a story. Was she sold, as some say? Did she live long seasons under a distant roof? Did she stitch herself into a life with small pleasures? The accounts vary and often depend on what the teller hopes to teach. The only steady thing is memory, the scream, the wet arc of water, the way it fell like an accusation that could not be ignored. In time the phrase does one further thing. It becomes less an order to keep the chin lifted and more a way of recognizing the trade-off of dignity. Mothers will say it to daughters as if it were a map and an alarm. Young women will whisper it to themselves before steps that are dangerous and beautiful. Men will mutter it with bemusement and sometimes with gratitude. To say it aloud is to name a history of small resistances that people enact even when the world weighs against them. It is a code that both wounds and heals. The patio remembers. On some afternoons when the sun sits tall and heat empties the voices, an old servant with a cane will lean on a balustrade and tell a child about a day when the air itself changed. The child's eyes widen, then squint against brightness, then look away toward the river as if the water might carry the truth back to them. The old servant will not claim he knew every fact. He will sigh instead and say that the thing mattered. There are sounds, he murmurs, that mark a house forever. He says it with a mixture of regret and relief, because such things are seldom simple. What becomes of Donna Constanza is a quieter footage. She continues to set out silver, to order the house to be made presentable, to receive visitors if they are safe, but she no longer feels at ease in the light that once affirmed her. She tends to her dress as a priest tends an altar, but there are hours when she looks into a mirror, and the reflection is a neighbor who once had the power to command, and feels beneath it a human vulnerability that shines like a dull coin. Some of her nights are restless. She dreams of being splashed and of the laugh of someone else. In the privacy of her rooms, she nurses a wounded dignity that refuses to be easily sewn back into place. The coronel, consumed in part by pride and in part by the practical need to preserve order, continues to count the costs. He invests in watchmen, in patrols, and in formal punishments as if each were a ledger entry that can balance the one the scandal made. He finds in the end that storms cannot always be bottled, and the notion that men can fully control the narrative of their households becomes in his mind softer and more complicated. As for Benedita, she remains both a person who existed in a specific place and a figure that has traveled far in the mouths of those who remember. Some will insist they have proof of her later life. Others will claim that her story is a necessary fiction. And so the story settles into a steady ambiguity, the kind that histories often assume when they cannot fully account for the decisions of people who leave. Years later, in a different season, a child, grandchild to a woman who lived in the Cenzala, will ask why the household servants have a small private rule they repeat under breath. The elder will answer with a quick, almost involuntary brightness, "Never lower your head." The child will repeat the phrase as if it were a talisman, and then ask what it meant. The elder will tell a careful version, a story of a pail of water, a scream at noon, and the price of being seen. She will leave out the most raw details and emphasize the lesson that courage and cost walk together. She will not promise easy triumphs. She will not, if she is honest, promise that no harm followed. She will instead make of the story a complex advice that both warns and instructs. And so the story becomes a part of a people's grammar, an episode that is neither wholly triumphant nor wholly tragic. It is a wound and a seed. It is a mark on a household and a lesson to children. The noon scream remains the hinge point because it is the thing that cannot be forgotten, the ringing of a voice that reversed a ritual long held steady. The patio will take pulses of light and years of paint, and still remember the day a woman's action made the mistress scream in front of everyone. If this story moved you, share it with someone who would listen to the small, complicated acts of courage that change the shape of a house and the rhythm of a river.